The player base of the Frostbite engine era can be divided into two large groups, and their needs as well as interests are at odds with each other. As a result, every change DICE or BF Studios makes that is aimed to satisfy one group inevitably upsets the other, as we've seen over and over again since Battlefield 3. Obviously, each group wants the game to fulfill their specific needs, so that it creates the experience they are looking for. What the other group wants is just wrong, stupid, and does not belong in Battlefield. Now, instead of looking at the needs of each of these groups and trying to satisfy everyone, we should do an inspection of the game itself to identify which areas have problems or simply fail to fulfill their intended purpose, and then implement solutions to these problems, regardless of which group they please or upset. Game design must not be about trying to please everyone. It must be about developing a coherent game with a clear vision and specific experience in mind. That is something that EA and Battlefield Studios are unwilling to do, which is what led to games being a messy collection of features and designs that not only don't work together, but even pull the game in different directions. This was especially true for Battlefield 5. Now, I've been completely rewriting the script 5 times and changed the title 3 times, because if we were to investigate every aspect of the game that does not fulfill its original purpose, then we would end up with a 3-hour-long talk. And we know that most viewers don't even watch a 10-minute short video in its entirety. Game mechanics act as guardrails to enable a specific online experience and prevent players from doing something that harms or prevents that intended experience. Players will always find a way to bend the rules, break and exploit certain mechanics. Dolphin diving, for example, was the result of players breaking the animation system in Battlefield 2, which is why it got patched out. It was not a mechanic that the developers created on purpose. Right now there are players who continue to ask the designers to tone down or even remove certain mechanics that they say are limiting their skill expression. These players either knowingly or unknowingly want the game to be even more chaotic than it already is. Those of you who have seen any of my previous design concepts, like the one for Battlefield 1982,
Welcome to duty.
know that I keep bringing up mechanics of the previous Battlefield games because I've seen firsthand how the online experience in Battlefield changed for the worse when many of its core design principles and mechanics were simplified or removed entirely. When I bring up and show mechanics of old Battlefield games, it reveals the two groups I talked about earlier. There are the players who tell me that these are boring minigames that are just annoying and turn the game into a military simulation. And no one would play this game today. Which I find is an interesting argument considering that extraction shooters and battle royale games are not only much more hardcore than Battlefield ever was, they are also extremely successful. So there seem to be many players out there who like games that are more demanding. These are probably the players from the other group I get feedback from, who cannot believe how much more effort DICE used to put into enabling a specific experience. One that was about creating tactical depth, teamwork and variety, while still avoiding the game turning into a full-blown military simulation. After all, if Battlefield 2 were a milsim, then modders would not have had a reason to create the Project Reality mod for it, which eventually led to the standalone game Squad. So let's look at some of these so-called boring minigames that existed in Battlefield before and evaluate their impact on the online experience. In Battlefield 6 we hear players say that they get burned out and bored by infantry combat. That is not surprising considering that the pace has become even faster, caused by the fast time to action created in a big part by the condensed map design, as well as the very low time to kill. But the movement plays a role here too. This faster pace further prevents depth from existing because you can see that most players don't have the cognitive space to do more than constantly look for threats and react to them. So how would you add interesting mechanics to infantry combat when there's no room left? So in Battlefield 2 you can sprint, you can jump, you can sprint, jump and go prone. It's by no means a static military simulation like many want you to believe. But there are two key mechanics that act as guardrails, or even like an overpressure valve that prevent infantry combat from getting out of control. The first mechanic is that bar in the lower left corner that is slowly depleting when you are sprinting, and more so when you are jumping. That is your stamina. So what would happen if we would add this to Battlefield 6? You could still sprint, you could still slide, you could still jump. It doesn't slow that down at all. But you cannot chain these together indefinitely. This mechanic is like an overpressure valve, like an overheating mechanic that ensures that this increased pace only happens in bursts. As a result, transport vehicles that are already on the map are finally attractive again. Providing transport to other players is also important again. It will demand better tactical decision making from you, as you will get punished when you run across the battlefield like a headless chicken. Besides that, it makes sticking together with your squad mates more important again, as you are much more vulnerable when you are on your own. It also rewards map knowledge, positioning, and the use of cover, which raises the skill ceiling and gives you more opportunity for skill expression. It adds depth to infantry combat, as you need to think more, but it also gives players more time to plan ahead, assess the situation around them, and then decide what to do next. This is what you call quiet time in game development, and Battlefield Studios has made the catastrophic mistake to remove it completely. The second mechanic is found in the ammo design. Battlefield 6 uses what is called a round pool. With this design you have as many reloads as you have rounds in your pool. You can fire one shot and reload, fire another shot and reload. And you always end up with a full magazine, as just one round is removed from the pool, as you do not reload magazines but individual rounds. This makes ammo management extremely simple, to the point where it has next to no impact on gunfights, as you always have a full mag. Battlefield 2 on the other hand uses a rather crude and extreme mag pool design, where you deploy with a specific number of magazines. You can also experience this in Battlefield 4 when you play on a server that uses the classic preset, or even in Battlefield 6 when you play an experience that has magazine reloads enabled. With that system you get a limited number of magazines, as you can see in Battlefield 2. In the Frostbite games, DICE sadly did not bother to adjust the HUD when this feature is enabled. So when I fire one round and reload, then I drop the entire magazine on the ground and lose all the remaining rounds in it. This means that in this case here in Battlefield 6, I can reload 6 times and then I'm out of magazines. As I said, this mechanic is extremely crude, and everyone who played Battlefield 2 back in the day begged DICE to eventually refine that system so that we essentially get what Insurgency Sandstorm uses today. Here you can see that I have 4 magazines, where one is in my rifle. When I fire a few rounds and then reload, then the used magazine goes in my pocket. When I fire a few more shots so that I end up with just a few rounds left in the magazine, I might find myself in a situation where I need a fresh magazine fast, and I don't mind losing the few remaining rounds. In that case I can then double tap the reload key, which will then drop the magazine on the ground and I get a fresh magazine faster. I lost that magazine and its remaining rounds though. When I then continue to fire and reload until I end up with just used magazines, then on the next reload it will always insert the magazine with the most rounds left. Pressing the reload key again does nothing, as I already have the magazine with the most rounds in my gun. So what would that do in Battlefield 6? It discourages full auto spraying and encourages tap firing or even switching firing modes. It pushes players towards aiming for headshots more. It pushes players to aim better before pulling the trigger. It makes teamwork more important, as well as having a good squad composition. It raises the skill floor and ceiling at the same time and creates more room for skill expression, as you must manage your ammo and think about when to reload, and if it's better to do a tactical reload than a normal reload. For months I have seen players demand that more depth and room for skill expression is added to infantry gameplay. And this, people, is how you can do that, combined with a rework of the weapon design to show your true skill when it comes to aim, understanding bullet drop at range, and recoil compensation. Then let's talk about helicopters. In Battlefield 6, the skill of piloting a helicopter comes from the player's ability to evade 20 RPGs, 5 TOWs, stationary AA, mobile AA, guided shells, laser-guided missiles, small arms fire, the other attack helicopter, and then the jets that come from above, and all of that from the second he lifts off the ground. This design is an overcorrection and the result of players on the ground rightfully complaining about how oppressive attack helicopters were in Battlefield 3 and Battlefield 4. I'm not talking about 2042 because I played that game for a total of 15 hours at release and then never touched it again. So I say that players on the ground rightfully complained about attack helicopters because DICE made the mistake of introducing auto repair and infinite ammo in Battlefield 3, which allowed the pilot and gunner of an attack helicopter to stay in one area of the map almost indefinitely, and so even get players on the enemy team to rage quit the server. DICE also made the mistake of greatly simplifying the flight model, so much so that almost anyone could keep a helicopter in the air with little to no practice required, which only made matters worse. What DICE did in Battlefield 6 not only put the attack helicopter at the bottom of the food chain, it also made the transport helicopter completely useless and unable to fulfill its role, as its survivability is even worse than the one of the attack helicopter because of how big and slow it is. So what is the solution? In combined arms combat, vehicles in general must be strong, but not omnipresent, as that makes them oppressive and extremely frustrating to deal with. Vehicles should mainly be dealt with by other vehicles, not have infantry be a bigger threat to vehicles than they are to infantry. But to get this right, you need to design the entire game to achieve that balanced experience. One aspect of that design is that no vehicle, but especially jets and helicopters, can have auto repair or regenerating ammo. When the pilot and gunner must use their limited ammo wisely, they start to pick targets more carefully. As a pilot, you don't waste a missile on a single infantry player. You make sure that your gunner gets a chance to deal with him while you wait for a better target to use your missiles on. Even though the attack helicopters in Battlefield 6 have limited ammo, you don't see this happen there. But the reason for that is the low survivability of helicopters, which causes that most pilots just try to take out anything that moves before they are inevitably one-hit killed by a RPG, TOW, or any of the other 10 players that constantly aim at you. As I said, combined arms combat is a complex system, where you need a coherent design for the entire game to enable the intended, balanced gameplay experience. And just tweaking numbers and loadouts is not going to do that. You need to implement mechanics that enable this experience. So when a pilot must return to a helipad or an airstrip to rearm and repair, then this does not only give the troops on the ground more time to breathe and finally move out of their main base, it also makes control points with the helipad more valuable and gives the enemy team more opportunities to take down a retreating helicopter on his way back to an airfield or helipad. This then raises both the skill floor as well as the skill ceiling, as the pilot must now make more complex decisions. Then there's the flight model, which DICE simplified way too much, to a degree where almost anyone can easily keep it in the air without much, if any, practice. In terms of flight mechanics, you hit the skill ceiling very fast in Battlefield 6, which is one of the main reasons why piloting a helicopter is so incredibly boring and repetitive. Helicopters as well as jets must be mechanically challenging. That is where the skill expression and the fun from being a pilot comes from. The attack helicopter does not provide that, and DICE seems to try to compensate for that by giving the pilot more weapon systems and so more things to do. That, however, is a fool's errand, as it only makes the helicopters more annoying, especially as they are given more lock-on and guided weapons that feel incredibly lame and cheap. Battlefield Studios could remove all the loadout options from the attack helicopter in Battlefield 6 and only equip it with a bare minimum loadout, like unguided Hydra missiles for the pilot and a rotary cannon as well as a TV missile for the gunner, and the experience would still be exactly the same. Well, that's not exactly true, because then it would probably play better. But this is to show that you don't create depth by adding more stuff on top of a boring foundation. First you need to make the foundation fun and have room for skill expression. Then you can add things on top that make sense and further enhance the experience. This applies to all areas of the game. You could remove almost all the different tank shells, mines, launchers, ammo types, etc. and the game would still play pretty much the same, as this variation does not improve the underlying foundation that makes the game so boring and repetitive. But as I said, there is no silver bullet. You cannot implement just the mechanics that I showed here and expect that this fixes the game. It is a complex system, a big puzzle with many parts that all must work together to create a coherent and balanced game. My personal experience of having played every single Battlefield game to date at the time it was released has taught me that being able to sprint indefinitely, always having a full magazine, being able to stay in one area of the map almost indefinitely with my attack helicopter, not having to work with my squad mates because I get auto-healed, and so much more, is what turned Battlefield into such a shallow and repetitive experience. A shadow of its former self. The mechanics I showed existed in previous Battlefield games for a reason. They acted like an overpressure valve to avoid that things got out of hand, and steered players in a direction that allowed the game to provide the experience as it was intended by the game designers. The lack of a clear direction, and making everything optional, like teamwork, is why Frostbite Engine Battlefield games always had a problem with playing the objective, which is why matches mostly end with several hundred tickets to 0. Battlefield Studios also keeps making the situation worse with their unlock requirements, missions and challenges, where many of these get players to not play towards the goal of the game mode as they focus on completing a challenge instead, since these are also tied to the Battle Pass, which is built around creating the fear of missing out on content if you don't complete these challenges in time, ultimately leading to a bad online experience for everyone. And then there's the systemic lack of teamwork and the absence of that signature me and my boys experience when it comes to playing as a squad. Squad gameplay and the design of the squad leader has never been in a worse state than it is in Battlefield 6. And this is entirely the fault of the developers. Or maybe, better said, the fault of the decision makers that tell the developers what they must build. Battlefield is a very large game, with many more mechanics and moving parts than Call of Duty. Because of that, for a Battlefield game to function properly, a certain amount of complexity and depth, as well as demanding a minimum level of teamwork and mechanical as well as tactical skill from players, is required. Going below these thresholds to appeal to an audience that frankly does not even want to play a Battlefield game, is what led to the shallow, boring and repetitive experience we have today. The problems of Battlefield 6 cannot be fixed by releasing more content or small tweaks. Even classic maps like Firestorm feel worse in Battlefield 6 because this game does not have the game design required to create the experience you remember. Looking back at all the games they have released since they fixed Battlefield 4 with the CTE initiative, EA and Battlefield Studios have once again shown that they are either unwilling or unable to learn from the past and deal with the problems they created themselves. And it remains to be seen if they can grow a backbone and fully commit to building a coherent gameplay experience again, one that does not copy nor imitate others, but stands firmly on its own feet.